we were talking earlier about the competition with China. We're working from different playbooks, but US and Japan are on the same side. And so it's very, very important for us to be continuing to have that collaboration in order for us to be competitive going forward. Technology is at that nexus of security in a way that it hasn't been. And that's what I think is so exciting about the work that Geodesic is able to do and the partners we're able to work with.
But within technology, there's, of course, different categories, right? There's cybersecurity, there's autonomy, of course, artificial intelligence.
Respectively, how do we bring the best of technology into U.S. defense industrial base, Japan's defense industrial base, and then how do we work together? And I think that's the key issue.
Hey, Suzanne, welcome back to Japan and welcome to the Dome Podcast Studio.
Thank you, Marcus. It's exciting to be here for the first time.
I know. Actually, you're on your way back to the United States, right? Back to California.
Yes.
How many times have you been to Japan this year?
This year, this is my 9th trip.
9th trip, okay. And you've been coming to Japan, living in Japan, working in Japan for many decades.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm actually really excited to have this chat, to get to know you a bit better. And also to get your insights into kind of what's happening in the world, especially with regards to the U.S.-Japan alliance. There's a lot happening in the world today, as you know. The United States and Japan have a lot in common, but we also have a lot of differences.
Fair.
We're both democracies.
Mm-hmm.
We both believe in the rule of law,
mm-hmm.
In human rights,
mm-hmm.
international cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
We have generally capitalist / market economies.
Mm-hmm.
Those are our similarities. On the differences, of course, we have very different histories,
mm-hmm.
Different languages, different cultures, different communication, ways of communicating. And of course, different decision-making processes.
Mm-hmm.
And but despite all of those, we've been able to overcome a lot of those, pretty significant differences, and really build an incredibly strong partnership.
Mm-hmm.
So, any other thoughts on why we're in the position we are today with the U.S. and Japan having such a close relationship?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you really captured the importance that we have so much in common in terms of values and a respect for what we think the international community should look like and the roles we want to play. And, we can't really discount the role that geopolitical environment has played in developing this alliance over time. And it really has changed, when I get a chance to spend time with some of the folks who've been doing this even longer than me and think about what it was like, for example, during the Cold War. I mean, it's a pretty amazing story, right, of how we were fighting in the war, brutal war.
Yes.
And then during the Cold War, especially, the U.S. identified a real need to partner with Japan and to, use Japan as part of our containment strategy.
Yes.
And it was a little, not transactional, but of course it was very much less, it was not a partnership. Nobody would have described our relationship then as a partnership.
Yeah.
And we had a shared strategic objective of containing the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And Japan was convenient for us and gave us a place to operate our forces. And so, when I got to start working on the alliance, was after the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And there was really more of a regional view between our two countries, and really thinking about China, Taiwan, thinking about the rise of North Korea and as a threat to the region. And so we worked together, but even still, I wouldn't call it a partnership, right? The U.S. and Japan had different roles that we were playing. U.S. was obviously far more dominant by definition because of the way our alliance is structured. Japan has self-defense forces. We had our forces here in the region. And so, but we had a shared objective, and that's always
mutual
been
interests. Right?
Mutual interests, common strategic objectives is something we always used to go back to in the Pentagon. When we'd have frustration and friction over particular issues, we would kind of hit a reset button and look together at what are the common strategic objectives, and there was such overlap, so little daylight, between our two countries. And then, Japan, I think especially, you and I were both here right before 2000, and within right after that was 9/11 attacks.
Yeah.
And I think Japan really saw a need to step up and support the U.S. and show their support and be more involved in, refueling activities and boots on the ground in the Middle East, and really became more and more of an operational partner in building up its capabilities. And to me, it's pretty stunning to see how much Japan has become a partner.
Yeah.
Now, there's still structural things in our alliance. We provide the nuclear umbrella.
Yeah.
We don't have mutual defense. Only the U.S. needs to defend Japan. It's not a mutual defense, but there really is a lot more partnership.
Yeah.
What's really stunning to me is to see how global Japan is today. And, they're a partner of consequence.
Yes.
When you're looking at what's happening in the Ukraine, they are effective in engaging in some regions that are actually harder for us right now, like the global south. And they're an essential partner for dealing with global issues like climate change or, and preserving also the protection of critical technology, which is, I think, something really important to as we think about geodesic and some of the things we pay attention to.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That is a really good perspective, especially when you do look back in history and you understand where the relationship was in the not too distant past, right? I mean, this was just not too far before we were born, surely in the lifetime of our parents. It's interesting how you describe it and how it kind of evolved, though, from the early Cold War era, which was, as you said, more of a kind of a transactional or mutual interest type relationship. But how over time that grew into a full-blown alliance and a friendship, maybe even, right? For sure, right? Maybe a good lesson, I think, in geopolitics for everyone who's interested in those things to see how things can actually change, right? That's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that the geopolitical piece is important. We've already talked about then the people-to-people connections, which is super essential.
Yeah.
And we have such a good, right now, really favorable view of Japan. Japan is a very favorable view of the United States.
Yeah.
But the other dimension that I always think it's important to remember is leaders do matter.
Yes.
And, we've had very important leaders at the presidential level, but then also the ambassadors and secretaries of state and, cabinet and their counterparts in Japan are also extremely important in setting the course of the relationship. And I think, I get asked a lot of questions about, what's going to happen in a Trump administration.
Yes.
And, I think there's still so many questions about that. But it's very important, what his perspective, the president's perspective is, will drive the relationship for the next several years. And so we can anticipate maybe some changes. But I think that the fact that we have so many shared objectives and so many national interests, especially as we're looking at the competition with China, that gives me confidence that we're going to continue to have a productive and growing partnership going forward.
Yeah, because those shared interests that you mentioned earlier back in the Cold War era, those still exist today. If anything, they're more important than ever. But we also have the benefit of several decades now of actually working together and solving problems, right? And entering into treaties. And so hopefully, the future is bright going forward. And it's just about, okay, well, what's happening in the world today, right? And you mentioned some things. Obviously, there's a lot of political change in the United States. There's a lot of political change in Japan. And there's a lot of things happening on the broader global stage as well. So maybe from your perspective, I guess from a broader geopolitical perspective, then what are kind of the issues do you think that are top of mind for people involved in the U.S.-Japan alliance relationship?
That's a really great question. As I said earlier, I really do think what's interesting about the U.S.-Japan alliance right now, or I should say more broadly, the U.S.-Japan relationship, is it encompasses everything.
Yeah.
So there's really a global perspective. So I think probably top of mind is everything going on right now with Ukraine and Russia.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, as you know, Japan doesn't even have a peace treaty with Russia, and then also the Middle East, right?
Yeah.
And this week has been stunning to see some of the dramatic. I mean, the last couple of years have been obviously very dramatic in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So I do think those govern, but there's such a focus here in the region on China.
Yes.
And if you watch China relations with U.S. and Japan, there's different swings over the last several decades.
Yeah.
But I think people have really, we're no longer looking at trying to engage China as a responsible stakeholder. And it's very much more a competition about how do we protect our critical technologies and how do we compete. Although the competition with China is now purely global. It's no longer local or regional. And so I do think that's top of mind. And then I think it's important, sometimes in the United States, it's easy to forget about the threat from North Korea. And
Yes.
But when you're here in Japan, that threat from North Korea, the regional disruption that they pose, so they have their ballistic missile capabilities, their nuclear program are very, very important. And Japan has such a tough history with North Korea, with the abductions of their citizens. So I think that's very, very important. And it's concerning to have North Korea now with working with the Russians, fighting alongside,
Sending troops over into Ukraine.
Yeah. So those are, I think, some of the things that are top of mind. But again, U.S. and Japan are partners on everything. So I don't know if this is top of mind, but things like climate change and energy security, economic security certainly are have been important agendas under the Biden administration. And I think economic security, at least, I can't speak to what the climate agenda is going to look like going forward, but certainly economic security is going to continue to be a very, very important issue for both of our countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting how connected the world is. So even though Ukraine and Russia, what's happening in the Middle East, those are all kind of on the other side of the world from Japan. But not only do they impact things like energy, right, and food and those types of security issues, but also everybody's watching, right? Like, how is the United States going to respond, right? How is the rest of the world going to respond, right? And of course, China is watching, and maybe some of these other dictators, other leaders of the world are all watching how these things play out. And obviously that's going to kind of inform the decisions that they make in the future. And so everything's connected politically, economically, energy, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, I think that's the heart of deterrence, is that people see the U.S. and Japan aligned on so many issues in so many areas, and they see these common strategic objectives.
Yeah.
And that is what gives people confidence that if they attack Japan, the U.S. is going to be there to defend them, and that this is what makes the alliance so strong.
Yeah.
But I also think, just thinking about the papers this morning, which I realize this is going to probably be released later, so that comment won't make sense. Sorry. But anyway, but it was really moving to see that the Nobel Peace Prize went to the group of Japanese who are really promoting peace and reminding the world about the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And, I think Japan does have an important voice and a very individual and distinct role that they play globally because of that unique history. And that's an important part as well, I think, of their global impact. It's very different than what the U.S. can project globally.
Yeah, I mean, the Japanese are the only ones who actually lived through something like that. So it's not just something that's theoretical, right? They actually went through that, and they can provide that perspective, and they need to remind the rest of the world, like, what happens if you don't solve these things diplomatically, right? So, that was an amazing thing that happened. So hopefully we learn our lesson. I think a lot of people know you from your role previous to Geodesic with the U.S. Japan Council. But yeah, we just wanted to kind of dig into your background a little bit. And so the first pictures are, from your early days in the Navy.
In the Navy, that's right.
So, and how long were you in the Navy?
I was in the Navy for 13 years. I was
13
an
years,
intelligence officer in the Navy.
Okay.
And I joined the Navy through ROTC. So they paid for
Got it.
college in
Got
exchange
it.
for joining the Navy. And the Navy is really what brought me to Japan.
Okay.
So I had been very interested in China earlier in college, studied abroad.
Yep.
And I was really fortunate to be selected for a program called the Olmsted Scholarship. And the idea is to be a better officer, you should have a global mindset. To have a global mindset, you should live abroad. And so I was selected to come to Keio University and to spend 2 years I got to study Japanese first and then come to Japan and spend 2 years at Keio University studying China-Japan relations.
Got it. And so this next picture here on the next slide, there's Keio University. Of course, there's Japan. And this is you. Is this like a newspaper article?
It was a magazine article that one of the women in that picture wrote. So the picture on the left is actually the ship that I was assigned to, the USS Blue Ridge. And that's the command and control ship that is the flagship of the 7th Fleet. And we're forward deployed in Yokosuka, Japan. And that picture is kind of a special picture to me because there's so few women in the Navy. And when I was on the ship, we put together some events to support women's leadership. And I invited some women from the Japanese community, and they were really interested to see and learn from Americans about how we were thinking about women in leadership and so forth. So one of the women who participated wrote that article about the experience.
Nice. And I noticed you're wearing a different uniform in this picture than you were in the previous uniform. Is that just because it was a different occasion, or were you promoted? Or
no, the other one was my summer uniform, and this is my. It's different seasons.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, what years were that about?
Yeah, so I was at Keio University in the late 90s, and then we had such a great experience here. Actually, it was my husband said, "Oh, I really hope we can stay here." So then I got a 2-year assignment on the USS Blue Ridge in Japan. So I was here for the late 90s between those two assignments.
Okay, I was here in 97 for the second time doing an internship as an MBA student.
Oh, really? Where were you?
I was in Tokyo. Yep, in Tokyo.
Yeah, so 97 is when I was here. 97 to 2000.
Oh, that's exactly when I was here, actually, the end of 97. Yeah. Let's go on to the next picture. Okay, so this is a really interesting picture here. Obviously, that's you with former Prime Minister Abe. But at this time, I think you were studying policy, right?
Yeah, so actually after the experience of being here in Japan and having looked at China earlier in my, as an undergraduate student, really made me passionate about the U.S.-Japan alliance. When you look at China from a U.S. perspective and from a Japan perspective, especially when you're already in the Navy, it's so clear that the alliance is the core way to preserve our national security and advance our national security, and super important, obviously, to Japan as well. And so I really got the policy bug. And so the picture that we're looking at on the right, I got a chance just to spend a couple months working at the White House. I was actually the China director for just a short time. It was truly somebody was on, there was a gap between China directors. And so I got to fill in for a few weeks one summer. That was me, my opportunity to be in the Oval Office, which was super exciting.
That's amazing.
And that was actually President George Bush was making his first phone call with the Chinese counterpart to congratulate them on getting the Olympics bid. And I was just prepping him. And that was a good example of being at work on July 4th when nobody else was there. So I got to get in there. Normally it would have been someone more senior.
That's cool.
It was a lot of fun. And so that experience at the White House is what gave me the opportunity to really get involved in policy work and to really realize that I wanted to do policy work rather than intelligence work. And so this was when Prime Minister Abe, he was not Prime Minister at the time. He accompanied Prime Minister Koizumi when he came to visit the United States. And I think Abe-san was like maybe Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary or something like that. And so this was a small dinner for him at that occasion. So
wow. That must have
been like 2001.
Okay. Wow, incredible. And that's obviously Condoleezza Rice, right? Who
Condoleezza
was the
Rice,
Secretary of State under
She was
George
the
W.
National
Bush?
Security Advisor at that time.
Okay, got it. And did you have a chance to work with her very closely, or was?
Yes, when I was filling in on the China desk for the couple months at the White House, it was under her. So I was working for her.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
Just another day at the the Oval Office, right?
Yeah. So, and again, like I said, I really became passionate about how can I support the U.S.-Japan alliance.
Yeah.
And this experience, though very short in my career, is part of why I decided to leave the Navy and work in the Pentagon as a civilian, so I could work and focus on the U.S.-Japan alliance as a bureaucrat.
Okay. And I was actually going to ask you that question because the first part of your career was in the Navy, obviously, and then the Department of Defense. But when you moved over to the State Department, you left the military. Is that?
Yeah, so I left the military and became a civil servant working at the Pentagon. So I was in not in uniform any longer, supporting the Secretary of Defense on his policy for Japan.
Okay, so that was a civilian role.
It was a civilian role. I did that for about 7 years and became the Japan director.
Okay.
When I moved to the embassy, I was still technically part of the Department of Defense.
Got it.
So
okay.
Yeah.
Got it. And you have some pictures, I believe, of the time that you were serving with the Department of Defense. Here. Yeah. So that's Donald Rumsfeld.
That's Secretary Gates.
Oh,
down here. Yeah, Donald Rumsfeld.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And here.
Yeah, so the middle picture with Donald Rumsfeld, I worked a lot on base realignment and Okinawa issues. So that was when we came back to report to Secretary Rumsfeld on some progress we'd made in our discussions with the Japanese about bases in Okinawa.
Okay.
And the picture at the bottom right is actually the treaty called the Guam International Agreement. And this was to solidify some of the agreements we had come up with the Japanese around our basing. And so that was an agreement I was very closely aligned with and worked on.
Wow.
And it was the first agreement she signed as Secretary of State.
Oh, wow. Amazing. I imagine those were not easy negotiations. I'm sure you probably don't want to or can't get into the details. But I imagine that, because what we see on the news, of course, are the signings, right? It's like after all of the hard work is done, but I'm sure there was a ton of negotiating, communications, back and forths that led up to that moment. So that's pretty incredible that you were involved in that.
Yeah, it's very interesting because Japan is such an important ally that the relationship, you always start with this perspective of we have something so important that we're getting done together, which is strengthening the U.S.-Japan security relationship.
Yep.
And Japan may come in with things they're trying to get done, and we have what we're trying to accomplish for the United States. But ultimately, we're always working for the same goal, which is to have a strong, enduring alliance. And so you do have your moments of tension and friction, but it's always undergirded with this shared goal. So that makes it really fun.
Yeah.
And again, we have our moments of tension, but in the end, a lot of the folks that I work with, most of the folks I've worked with in Japan are people I consider friends as well. So.
Yes. Wow. After the Department of Defense, then you moved over to the State Department, right? Which is a different organization.
I actually was assigned to the embassy.
Okay.
And so most of the people in the embassy work for the State Department or another part of the U.S. government.
Yep.
When Ambassador John Roos became ambassador, he was allowed to bring in one person to come in as sort of his person, not really reporting back to someone else back in Washington, D.C. And so I was his senior advisor in that role. So that's when I first had the opportunity to work with John Roos. Obviously very important to me. So.
Yes.
So here he is. Right? He's the ambassador. And as a senior advisor, I got to work on a lot of the policy issues with him. And we had a great time. Did a lot of really fun and interesting things. But as you know, during our tenure was when the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster took place. And so that really changed the nature of the work that we were doing. And this was Secretary Clinton visiting after the earthquake and tsunami and coming in thanking embassy staff for their work to support Japan and the American citizens in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, I was here, living here, and I remember that time well. Of course, I was kind of on the outside looking in to see, what the communications were gonna come out of the embassy. Of course, all of American citizens living in Japan, and I think there's quite a few, right? 100,000-ish. But yeah, it was amazing to see how that all played out and how the decisions were made to stay, right? Because a lot of the other embassies were leaving.
Yes.
And that wasn't necessarily a wrong call for them because, they probably wanted to be careful. But personally, I was really glad that, the U.S. Embassy decided to stay and to, fight together with the people of Japan to, help Japan recover. So it must have been amazing actually being part of all of that and being in those, a part of the decision-making process with Ambassador Roos, with Secretary of State Clinton, and all the other staff members there. So,
yeah, no, it was very, for somebody who had spent so much of my career in the military and at the Department of Defense, as you know, in the response, the U.S. response to support Japan, which was called Operation TOMODACHI, there was a very, very strong military component to that. It was more than military. It was really whole of government, but the military was much more visible. And so to have a chance to be, I think we all felt so helpless when we saw the images and saw what was happening in the Tohoku region. And so to actually not be completely helpless, but to be in a position to bring together some of my professional background and support the ambassador and support others. It was very, very exciting.
And to understand how the military works and to know people and how decisions are made and things like that, I'm sure were a huge asset to Ambassador Roos at that time. And out of that,
I want to take the opportunity to say, how important Ambassador Roos's leadership was at that time. He brought such an important perspective, and I really, really believe you mentioned about how the U.S. government stayed, our U.S. embassy stayed in place, in fact, grew. We had something like, I think, 150 people come and join us at the embassy. And I really credit Ambassador Roos with the leadership and the vision to, of course, make sure we were being cautious and we're taking care of American citizens who were in Japan. We lost 2 Americans in the tsunami, and really thinking about the risks around radiation, but also making sure that we were doing what was going to be best for Japan and then for the alliance. So,
Well, in hindsight, it was most definitely the right decision. And again, having observed it up close, living in Tokyo at the time, it was incredible to watch. So it's cool to kind of get the inside perspective on that as well. And then out of all of that, there was a lot of good that came out of it ultimately, not only the strengthening of the U.S.-Japan alliance, but also programs like the Tomodachi program, right? Which I know you were, very heavily involved in.
Yeah, Ambassador Roos, we'd go to all his speeches and help write them, and he'd always talk about the importance of the security aspect of the relationship, which is my bread and butter, where my heart is, and then the economic aspects of the relationship, trade, which was something that I was getting a chance to be exposed to and learn when I worked at the embassy. And he'd always talk about the foundational side of the relationship and how important the foundation, the people-to-people connections. He really prioritized from the start of his tenure promoting entrepreneurs. Actually, it was always a big part, explicit part of his agenda to foster entrepreneurship, to advance better relationships between Congress and the Diet, and particularly Ambassador Roos always had a focus on young people and trying to increase the number and quality of student exchanges. And in a way, to be honest, I felt like a lot of that was lip service. And then we went through the experience of 3/11 and the Operation Tomodachi and the whole of government response, and we saw how much society surged to help Japan. And you really saw the special relationship. And honestly, that just was a big turning point in my life. And I saw that those people-to-people connections are essential. We wouldn't have had the response without those people-to-people connections.
And those are people at all levels of society. At all levels,
right? So business to business, entrepreneur to entrepreneur, students. There were so many people who had been teachers through the JET program and had been in Japan who came back to help, sister city programs, just a whole range of things. And I, it was kind of so Ambassador Roos had this idea that after the Operation TOMODACHI and the military had to return to its traditional military missions, which it needed to. There were a lot of things going on in the region. But we couldn't just walk away from Japan. So he had this idea to call the TOMODACHI Initiative. And it ended up becoming something that was public-private, sponsored by U.S. and Japanese companies for the most part, and focusing on young people and helping bring young people between our two countries. And the embassy partnered with a nonprofit called the U.S. Japan Council to create the TOMODACHI Initiative. And so I was helping Ambassador Roos and Matt Fuller and Susie Roos and others get that going from the embassy side.
Got it.
And I decided to kind of throw Ambassador Roos used to say this was our startup. And so I left government to continue to work on our startup of the TOMODACHI Initiative. And that's when I pivoted to nonprofit.
Got it. And that's when you worked for the first time, right, at the U.S. Japan Council.
Yes.
And just to clarify a little bit, the TOMODACHI Initiative sends Japanese young people over to the United States, right?
It's both directions.
It's both directions. Okay, that was my question.
Yeah, it's both directions and different age groups. Now it's primarily, I would say, high school and college students. And it was always designed to go beyond just the Tohoku region. And so we have 10,000 alumni from the program.
Wow, that's amazing.
But it's a whole range of communities, not just Tohoku. So young women, youth with disabilities, different groups of people from different regions, Okinawa, near and dear to your heart, get to participate.
Wow. And it's, of course, still ongoing today,
yes.
right? That's amazing. So the startup lives on.
That's right.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, well, that's thanks for providing, all of that kind of background on yourself, that perspective that you bring.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure. Yeah.
The reason I live in Silicon Valley right now is because I did have a chance to work at the Toyota Research Institute.
That's
and
right.
So just one other opportunity in my career. So I spent 3 years at Toyota Research Institute, which does a lot of work with kind of thinking about what's next for Toyota, obviously, with automated driving and robotics and things like that. So that was what brought me to Silicon Valley.
Got it.
7 or 8 years ago.
And until then, mostly you were on the East Coast?
DC
in
or
Washington,
Tokyo.
DC. In Tokyo. Okay, got it. Okay, well, I'd like to pivot now a little bit. What about technology?
Okay.
Let's talk about technology. Again, I know you have a really interesting perspective, especially spending so much time in DC, understanding, the military kind of geopolitical side of things. But then, obviously, you moved out to California, as you mentioned, to work for Toyota Research Institute and got to experience a lot of things that are happening at the cutting edge of technology. And those two worlds are kind of coming together more and more.
That's true.
Right? And so just interested to get your perspective on kind of where you see kind of technical trends heading, specifically with, regards to how that might impact, the geopolitical situation.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways, I think, to talk about that. But what was really stunning for me moving from Washington, D.C. to Silicon Valley and just seeing that such different cultures.
Yeah.
And
even within the same country, right?
Yeah, right. And, through Geodesic, we're always talking about connecting Japan and Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of differences even within our own country. And, the government, the military, I love those organizations and institutions. And but there is a lot of bureaucracy, and it's sometimes risk averse and slow and cumbersome. And so it's so different when you come to Silicon Valley, and the pace of change is so quick, that sense of possibility. And the speed at which change happens. So it's a pretty big gap, like to see the ideas and the tech, and of course, as we know right now, technology is changing, so fast.
Yes.
And so how that technology is able to be part of the national security system, part of our defense, it's pretty daunting. And you and I had the opportunity to attend a session with the head of Defense Innovation Unit, Doug Beck, a couple months ago. And, seeing how much of a challenge it is, even within our own country, to take the best of cutting edge technology and bring it to bear to support our government and national security. So that's been a really fascinating perspective for me, and I'm really trying to learn as much as I can about how we're doing that in the United States, and then what are some ways that we can then bring that to benefit the U.S.-Japan alliance as well.
Yeah. Okay. So Suzanne, you had mentioned and talked generally about technology and some of the things happening there and some of the challenges, right? And even within the United States domestically, figuring that out and what the strategy should be. But within technology, there's, of course, different categories, right? There's cybersecurity, there's autonomy, of course, artificial intelligence. Anything in particular that is kind of on your radar that you're kind of tracking right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been very interesting to me is to just think about our respective defense industrial bases and then how does some of the cutting edge technology fit into that, and how, so respectively, how do we bring the best of technology into U.S. defense industrial base, Japan's defense industrial base, and then how do we work together? And I think that's the key issue. I think that there are some key. We're no longer in a position where either of our countries can be at keep our technology at edge and be the leaders without support from each other. And so finding those ways to share information and to collaborate on technology, I think, is a really important way forward. I think that our countries are looking at that. And I think if you look at the joint statements that have been coming out between our two countries, there's a lot of focus on working together, but it's way easier said than done. And by definition, it's the technology is moving so quickly, and so much of the innovation is coming out of non-traditional startups and outside. It's not coming from the government. Right? So I think that's a really, really ripe area for collaboration and cooperation. So,
yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, we have to be aligned, of course, at the strategic level, but from an operations level and from a technical level too. If we're not working together, if there's no interoperability, then functionally, we won't be able to execute on the strategies that we have. So
that's right.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the internet, right? The internet runs on TCP/IP, HTTPS, all of these protocols that allow the internet to operate the same way globally. But in the military as well, I guess some of those same principles apply. If we want to be working together with our allies, everything has to function.
And it's not going to happen on its own. It takes intentionality and really thinking through and making sure that the best of each of our countries' technology is shared with each other. I mean, we were talking earlier about the competition with China, China, and also how U.S. and Japan have some shared norms and respect for the rule of law and human rights. And so, in some ways, China is unconstrained in how it's developing its technology and how it treats data. Privacy and things like that. So I heard someone say the other day, I thought it was very wise, we're working from different playbooks, right? And so, but U.S. and Japan are on the same side. And so it's very, very important for us to be continuing to have that collaboration in order for us to be competitive going forward. And, I think we're in a time where national security is, technology is at that nexus of security in a way that it hasn't been in the past, or if it hasn't been coming from private sector. And that's what I think is so exciting about the work that Geodesic is able to do and the partners we're able to work with at Geodesic, because I think the innovation is coming from the people in our ecosystem, and we can think about how to bring that in to support both countries.
Yeah, that's been actually really fascinating to see. I've mostly been in technology over the past 20 plus years in my career, and have been a part of kind of that Silicon Valley culture. And it's been really interesting to see how that has changed with regards to how Silicon Valley views the military,
Yeah.
right? And Silicon Valley's interest in geopolitics and things like that, and how, and I think this was caused by, what happened in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. There was a realization in Silicon Valley that, they need our technology, right? The good guys, quote unquote, need our technology. And it was interesting to see how the culture kind of changed overnight, once there was a realization that there's consequences, right? And those consequences are real. And it's interesting to see, as you mentioned, how the startup ecosystem in Silicon Valley has kind of embraced its new role, right? As maybe not the leaders in, but being an important part of the ecosystem that is going to develop these technologies that are going to help keep the United States and our allies safe. And so now you have founders that are starting, defense tech related startups.
Right.
You have, venture capitalists that are funding them, and just and then, as you mentioned earlier, working together with their counterparts in the government, in the military, to make sure that there's alignment there. And it's still early days, but it looks like things are headed in the right direction, at least. So
yeah, I think that the lines are, increasingly blurred between military defense and commercial applications. I think that's certainly increasingly true in space.
Yep.
As well as, I think it will be actually interesting to see in the Trump administration, it seems to be more leaders who have experience in Silicon Valley, who have experience in some of these technologies that you're talking about. So we'll see how that shapes the next couple of years.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting. And, we won't know, I guess, but we'll be a part of it, hopefully. And certainly people that we know will be a part of it. A lot of the companies that we work with will be a part of it. And as you mentioned, the people are a big part of what the ultimate outcomes are, right? And that's true at the highest of levels, and it's true in the government, in the private sector, et cetera, et cetera. So, I hope a lot of the people that are involved watch this podcast, right? And they can hear some of your perspective, because I think it's super important, especially. Again, just to repeat what I said in the beginning, your unique perspective, having worked, for so long across not only military, but government, private sector, technology, and now, of course, in venture capital with us at Geodesic. So thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today, Suzanne. And I know you're headed to the airport now, so safe travels.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Suzanne.